You're listening to Soundside. I'm producer Maliha Sayed. It's finally fall, and when I walk in the U District these days, I'm starting to notice colorful flannels, blundstones, and the occasional raincoat. Even among the most stylish of college students, I'm still seeing clothes that have come to define Seattle fashion, which, if you haven't heard, is bad. That's at least according to a long-held stereotype about our city's aesthetic. People like to make fun of the way Seattle-ites dress. They've labeled our fashion sense as normie, uninspired, boring. But is that a fair judgment for a city that popularized grunge and gorpcore? Which, by the way, if you haven't heard that second term, it basically just means wearing your Patagonia fleece or North Face rain jacket as an aesthetic choice. We're asking two local fashion experts to weigh in on whether Seattle is an unstylish city or if locals just earned a bad rap in their attempt to stay warm and dry. To start off, we asked both of them to bring articles of clothing into the studio that, to them, encapsulate Seattle fashion.
These shoes are from a designer named Guillermo Bravo, and they are very space-agey. They make you about 2 inches taller.
That's Andrew Hoge, a creative director and fashion writer in Seattle. And right now, he's showing me a pair of high-top black sneakers that I have to agree are very space-agey.
They have really clean lines and stitching, and they do have a removable pieces as well. So this, I think, is very representative of kind of where fashions in Seattle is going in terms of like streetwear and kind of thinking differently about what we're wearing.
He also brought in a rain jacket from Guillermo Bravo, which is a Seattle-based company. On closer look, it looks like the coat has a faint smattering of glitter.
And this is a reflective taffeta with a hood and exposed zippers and interesting seaming. So it's a rain jacket if you were to look at it, but the details are what makes it so unique and interesting.
The other person in the room is Clara Berg, a fashion historian and curator of collections at the Museum of History and Industry, or MOHI for short. And in true Seattle fashion, she's also brought a raincoat.
I brought in my Prairie Underground raincoat that I've had for probably close to 10 years.
Prairie Underground's a local brand, and one of its values is sustainability, which Clara thinks appeals to Seattle-ites who care about ethical consumption. Also, the raincoat just looks cool.
It's got sort of a cloak hood to it, which is a style that they have in one of their first popular pieces they made was a cloak hoodie. They're kind of these fitted hoodies that some of them are long that have this kind of big hood that kind of drapes around the shoulder. So this raincoat has a similar look to that.
She also brought in a few photos from the collection at MOHI. They're both pieces from Foster Hochberg, a Seattle manufacturer that Clara says was pretty big in the mid-20th century. One was a picture of a skirt and shirt that is patterned with a whole bunch of nods to the Emerald City in celebration of the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle. We're talking everything from the Space Needle to the monorail. She also showed me a photo of a red plaid flannel that you could totally see someone wearing around Seattle today, except it has shoulder pads.
And this is something that would have been very kind of like a college girl, like casual clothing that you would wear maybe with a pair of pants when you're just sort of out and about on campus or in your dorm. But I just love that it is sort of feels like you could wear it today, but it's from the 40s, the 50s.
After our mini fashion exhibition, I sat down with Andrew and Clara to discuss the hard-to-define and often maligned Seattle couture. There was this trend on TikTok. I don't know if y'all saw it, but it's called making myself a Seattle 10 or making myself a Miami 10. And basically the premise for people who didn't know, you're trying to make yourself look like the ultimate beauty standard of your respective cities. So Miami, New York, Los Angeles. And I could be wrong. I feel like in every other city, people took it very seriously. They did their makeup, their hair, they styled themselves. And when I would see the Seattle ones, more often than not, it was people in like climbing gear and dressed down. And not to say that's not a stylistic choice, but you could tell it was like poking fun, not self-serious, maybe self-critical because they were really disheveled. And it was this commentary on what Seattle fashion is. And so I want to ask both of you, I'll start with you, Clara. Did you see this trend and what did you think about it?
I did not see the trend, but I have, there's other examples that I can think of in the past. Probably about a decade ago, Vogue did a spread that was of sort of styles of a city, and Karlie Kloss was the one who was the model for Seattle, and she's not from Seattle, but she was one of the models in the spread, and it was like this like sleeping bag coat and plaid. And it was just, it's like those are the stereotypes, right? We think of Seattle, grunge is one of our big touchstones. Outdoor gear is one of our big touchstones. And it is true that I think Seattle is a city that kind of prides itself on not going with the flow. And I think thinking about fashion as something that's like, oh, that's like an institution or that's something I want to rebel from, that a lot of Seattle-ites take pride in being like, oh, we're not like that. I don't have to dress up, that we're different. And of course, keeping in mind that Seattle is a city with a lot of different people. And so any stereotype that you're going to make, there's absolutely people that do not meet that stereotype because we live in a place with lots of different people. And that's the joy of living in a city. But it is true that in Seattle's a place where we don't have people are not required to be dressed up for things. We don't have really strict dress codes. You can go to the opera and see people looking like they just came back from a hike. We don't feel like we have to fit a certain standard to go out and do the things that we want to do.
And Andrew, what about you? Did you see this trend?
So I actually took a look on the way on the way up here, and it's exactly what you said. It almost felt like a parody or just sort of poking fun at the stereotype of Seattle. I saw, and granted, I didn't see everybody who participated in this trend on TikTok, but it was very much like going from lying on your bed to throwing on a North Face, or all of a sudden you're hiking. So there was a lot of that. But I do think that, to Clara's point, we live in a city, and from my perspective, there is so much more to Seattle's fashion scene than just that stereotype. There are so many, hardworking designers and deep industrial histories in the city, and people who actually do love to dress up. And I think it's been happening more and more over the years. So it was fun to look at, but I certainly don't agree that that's just all that Seattle has to offer.
It's hard not to get a little annoyed.
Yeah, this is kind of the stereotype that just won't let go. And I guess I want to kind of turn to you because, Clara, you curated an exhibit that looks at functionality in fashion, and you've also written about it. Could you talk just really briefly, walk us through, I know it's a complex history, but could you try to give us a brief overview of how Seattle's fashion started and where functionality played a role in it?
I would say there's sort of two threads in that I would look at, is that I do think that being this far West Coast city, that we're a pretty new city, that a lot of people coming here were coming because they were leaving sort of the elitism of other places or looking to forge a new path, is that casual wear and sort of that less formality is part of Seattle's DNA and has been for a long time. However, historically, the idea, we're also a city that has wanted to kind of play with the big guys of being that we're a big city, we're important, and historically being a fashionable city and having connections to the rest of the world in terms of fashion and other things was important. And so we had some very important department stores, retailers, designers. That there has been also a high fashion history of Seattle for a long time, because that was a way to prove that we were a real city, that we knew what was going on in the fashion world, and that you could buy Paris couture in Seattle. But there's also that since the 60s, really, there has been overall in society, not just in Seattle, a sort of questioning of fashion as an authority. And that sort of this kind of countercultural movement, people do still care what they wear. If you're wearing your favorite, North Face, your outdoor gear, that is still a style. But because it's not Vogue, because it's not dictated by, Anna Wintour, then it's different, it's cool. And Seattle has really, I would say since the 60s, had that tack of that we're nonconformists.
Historically, can you pinpoint kind of when we got this reputation for being not fashionable, or when the stereotype started to crop up?
Well, I think certainly as far as people's national idea of what people were wearing in Seattle has to be connected to grunge. And that is very much a movement that came out of, we had the Boeing bust in the 70s and 80s. And so Seattle was a town that was kind of down on its luck, and that the musicians here, I mean, they would say, oh, we're just throwing on clothes, but they were picking stuff at the thrift store. They had an aesthetic that was trying to be different. They were separating themselves from sort of glam rock and some of the bands that were bigger in the 80s. And so then this hits the national scene, and flannels, which was tied to the fact of the kind of things that were in thrift stores here, that was popular in the working class in Seattle. So you could get a flannel very easily. The Doc Martens, but also sneakers that were just kind of sturdy and good in the rain. But it was still an aesthetic, but it was a sort of curated dress down aesthetic that was in distinct contrast to kind of the high gloss of the music industry that preceded it. And so it felt refreshing to the world when they saw this, of course, went with the music and went with that sound, that it felt like something different and it felt really authentic. It felt really genuine. Whereas it felt like a sort of a facade and sort of a big corporate image that people, that was a contrast in the music industry.
Yeah, that's pervaded too. It's still such a popular stylistic choice, not just here, but across the country. Andrew, you write weekly columns for the Seattle-Times.
Yes. So actually, the weekly column I had to run on Seattle-Times, it was called Summer's Best, which is a play on Sunday Best. And it's a 10-week run. But I've been profiling people who live in Seattle for 425 magazine, and previously before that, Seattle magazine, for the last 8 years or so. So, yes. Yes, sorry. Just to clarify.
No. I'm glad you did. Well, why did you start it, and what have you gotten out of it in constantly profiling people?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's been about 8 years that I've been doing this now. And what I see is, in the last 8 to 10 years, there, in my view, has been a huge shift in the way that stylish people in Seattle express themselves. Like, what you're seeing is very, very different than it was 8 to 10 years ago. And I think that, I can't exactly pinpoint exactly why. My intuition tells me it is fueled by greater access to fashion, whether it's online or on social media, whatever it happens to be, but also a huge influx of people moving to Seattle, and, Seattle growing so rapidly. And I think that these individuals have brought a different fashion thought process and a different sense of style that's starting to kind of blend into our city. And so I get to profile people from all walks of life, whether they're CEOs or, they work in the fashion industry or they don't, or I just, for this column, I had to keep my eyes open and just find people on the street that were stylish and just stop them and ask them talk to them about their outfit. And, I've always said that Seattle is very siloed when it comes to fashion. There isn't necessarily a fashion community that, it would exist in Los Angeles or New York or London, but there is certainly a lot of talent and options here. You have couture designers, you have retailers who do really beautiful curation. Vintage is a huge part of Seattle's scene, and continuously gets talked about more and more, in my opinion, these days. You can see Frida in Pioneer Square, not only curating a beautiful store with vintage clothing, but also creating community around it. And so I think in that sense, the experience that people have with fashion in Seattle is starting to evolve. And I think what recently brought it home for me was going to the Art Walk in Pioneer Square. And I'm telling you, that was an experience for me as someone who's lived here for 18 years and loves fashion. But when I turned a corner walking down First Avenue and I saw all of these individuals, street style, vintage, wearing evening gowns with sneakers. I mean, it was as good as New York fashion. And I'm like, where have y'all been? The question that I'm grappling with right now is what is it about the Art Walk that is kind of bringing all of these people together? And I think it goes back to what I said about, individuals like Erica at Frida, we're starting to curate community around fashion, and starting to talk about Seattle fashion in a different way. And to answer your question, that's what I've gathered from the people that I've profiled.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. I'm talking with Clara Berg, a fashion historian and curator of collections at Mohi, and Andrew Hoge, a creative director and fashion writer in Seattle. We're digging into all the things that define Seattle's fashion scene. When we're back, we'll talk about our city's influence on fashion across the country. That's coming up next on Soundside at KUOW. Back with more Soundside, I'm Maliha Sayed. I'm here with Andrew Hoge, a creative director and fashion writer in Seattle, and Clara Berg, a fashion historian and curator of collections at Mohi. We've been talking about the stereotype that the style here is bad, and we're about to get into the ways that Seattle has actually had a growing influence on fashion across the country. So I'm sure you caught wind of this profile that came out a few years ago. It was in Esquire, and it was about how Seattle is actually a fashion capital up with the likes of New York and Miami. And maybe you feel like this was overdue, but I guess I'll open this to both of you. They talked about how Gorpcore, for example, is very popular. Streetwear is very popular. And Seattle's obviously influenced by other places, but are there ways that you have seen Seattle shape the country in recent years? Because grunge is obviously a huge one that we saw take over and still has resonance. But are there other styles or subcultures that you see evidence of that started here or really got traction here and then just took off in other places?
So I was annoyed that article did not reach out to me because I was like, this is what I do. I talk about Seattle fashion all the time. But I did see that article. And I think sort of to what we were talking about earlier is that we have this category of like fashion, which we think of as sort of high fashion, what you would see in the pages of Vogue. And then we tend to sort of discount all the other things that also have made their ways onto runways of sort of. So one example, which I think the article touched on, is, Seattle's innovation in outdoor gear. And Eddie Bauer, it's sort of complicated, but in essence invented the down jacket. That the idea of the puffy down coat kind of has its origin with Eddie Bauer in the 1930s. And there's Balenciaga has made puffy down coats. So I think we're used to being like, oh, outdoor gear, that's not fashion. But there's elements of that has made its way into the sort of top runways of the world. And I think similarly with casual clothing, we're not a place that invented casual clothing, but we're a place that did it very well, the companies that were here. And fashion overall has become more casual in the last, I don't know, I would say, since the 60s, but also any last 30 years, that we're more comfortable wearing things that our grandparents would have considered like sort of at home only or weekend only clothes. And so I think that article is sort of making the point of that if we have a very narrow definition of fashion, then Seattle we might not think it's a fashion city, but there's also, if we broaden that definition, there's a lot of places that Seattle's innovated. There's a lot of things that Seattle, if we didn't invent it, we did it very well here, and that has been picked up other places. I think grunge is another example of that we used to kind of laugh about grunge, but it has come back again and again. It's considered a very important fashion movement. So I wish I had a punchy end for that, but I feel like I made some good points. Well, I might
elaborate just a little bit.
Please.
In a more specific and more recent way, I think that, to my earlier point, Seattle's really about innovation and doing things that are really, really, against the grain and thinking differently. And Casey Curran, who makes kinetic wearable sculptures, his pieces have shown up in runways around the world. So he partners with Iris Van Harpen for their fashion weeks. And what it is, it's whether it's a sleeve or a piece of a dress, they're small kinetic movements, almost like butterfly wings, that are part of the clothes. And it started with that designer collaboration, but 2 years ago, he actually created or contributed to a dress that was worn by Mona Patel at the Met Gala. So this is a very specific, not as broad as Eddie Bauer, but, in that way, that innovation, that thinking differently about what we put on our bodies cycled back to, the fashion capitals, quote unquote. And it's all from Seattle, and he's incredible. So I think that's really cool.
So we've been talking today about this reputation that Seattle has of being an unfashionable city. I am curious to know, Clara, I'll start with you. Does it matter that it has that reputation?
I think it matters if we think it's a bad thing. I think we've talked today about a lot of kind of there's nuances to that. There's upsides to it. There's a richness in the things that we might kind of laugh about of like outdoor gear or grunge that actually have really rich histories. I think I only really get irritated when people talk about it as that it's a bad thing and that we should be embarrassed, that it means that we're kind of less of a real city somehow. So I think it depends on sort of what your slant is on it. I think, that there's joy in what we have in Seattle. So if you're having fun with it, that's great. But if you are really being snarky and saying that there's no fashion here, there's never been fashion here, we're all garbage humans, I don't love that.
I would say it does matter. And I think especially because the fashion economy here in Seattle is very alive and well. I mean, there are real people running businesses and shops. And like I have so many friends who have opened up their own brands in the last couple of years. And something that I hear a lot is the need for, great pattern makers and sewers and seamstresses. And, I think it is important to acknowledge that Seattle has fashion so that we can connect those dots and really acknowledge that, fashion is an industry that deserves to be supported. And there is so much of it in Seattle that deserves to be recognized and appreciated.
You just heard from Clara Berg and Andrew Hoge, two people who know a lot about Seattle's fashion scene. Clara is a fashion historian and curator of collections at the Museum of History and Industry, and Andrew's a creative director and fashion writer based here in Seattle. Thank you both so much for being here and for coming in person. This is, I think, a hard conversation to have over Zoom. So
thank you.
It was a pleasure to get it dressed up for you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.